it's important for all nurses to advocate for themselves, for their practice, for their profession, for their patients. Without the nursing community advocating for itself, no other entity will. It is the nurse's responsibility to be their own advocate.
You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices talk cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm your host, Jaime Weimer, Oncology Clinical Specialist at ONS. And today we're talking with Alec Stone, ONS's Director of Government Affairs, about how oncology nursing advocacy has never been more vital or more effective than in the current health policy landscape. You can earn free NCPD contact hours after listening to this episode and completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Thanks for joining me today, Alec.
Happy to be here.
So to start our conversation, let's look at the 2022 midterm elections and its effect on the 2023 year and beyond. How do you foresee the results affecting healthcare and patients?
We're all familiar with the mantra, quote, elections matter. And the 2022 midterm elections did not turn out as many of the pundits predicted, but the U.S. House of Representatives did flip from Democrat to Republican. And that means that the speakership and all of the committees will have new leaders. As health legislation is introduced or reintroduced in 2023 in the 118th U.S. Congress, there'll be new chairs of the committees of jurisdictions over which handle, and I'm right now doing a lot of air quotes, health-related bills. So those include the powerful committees, and there are many committees and many powerful members, but specifically the Ways and Means Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the Education and Labor Committee. These are all typically where healthcare bills of different sorts originate and then land based on where they're placed through Congress. Almost all of ONS's bills are in one or more of these committees. That said, all of ONS's congressional activities are bipartisan. I want to make this very, very clear so that there's no confusion or angst later on. ONS does not engage in partisan politics. To be sure, ONS is political. The Society's health policy activities are political because they are active in the political and policy environment, but they are not partisan. ONS does not take sides. The Society does not have a political action committee and does not contribute to political campaigns. So the ups and downs of party politics is, of course, of interest and of consequence, but overall, we like to say that we play the cards that we are dealt. And so in terms of the impact of this, much more will be known in January and at the end of January and even in February when the new U.S. Congress is sworn in and the new chairs are appointed through their respective leadership in the House and in the Senate, and the Health Advocacy Committee and ONS included will spend the time in December in the special session commonly known as the lame duck, reviewing what legislation went through there and if it passed, and if it didn't pass, and if it should be reintroduced again. And we, by the way, have two major bills that are in that. I'll wrap it up this way in that it's a little bit like a game or a board game in that you're setting the pieces in the right places for the congressional session as it begins as a board game. We're not rolling the dice. We do have a formal health policy strategy to move our pieces forward. So more today is unknown than is known, but we're prepared as we go forward with our agenda.
Thanks so much for that. I mean, I really appreciate the kind of clarity and distinction you provided for participating in the political process, but not ascribing to one political party or the other, and how that is possible. That is our purpose and our function, especially at that federal level of, ONS has a voice that needs to be heard, but we work with whatever administration we have. And so I think that's important for nurses to understand that and appreciate that at their local level, at their state level, and even at the national level, that participating in that political process is important. And nurses can do that regardless of what political party they may or may not ascribe to or is empowered in their local setting, it's still important to participate. So I appreciate you clarifying that. So what does that mean for ONS and the oncology nursing community specifically?
So legislation that becomes law that are on the ONS formal health policy agenda will help nurses and patients in the areas of palliative care and lymphedema treatment, two of our long list of areas. Both are patient-centered care and about the oncology nursing workforce. If those bills are not signed into law at the end of 2022, then I would expect that the very large coalitions, of which ONS is a leading partner as I like to say that we are the nursing voice in the cancer community, we are the cancer voice in the nursing community, and that we are a member in the general health advocacy community. And so we have distinct roles to play in those three buckets. And so we are parts of larger coalitions. These are not just ONS's bills. There are literally hundreds of groups, provider groups, patient advocacy groups, associations that are promoting this. So my expectation would be that if those pieces of legislation that for the last decade have been pushed through will be reintroduced again if they are not signed into law, and we would have to get the same sponsors to come through. And so both in the House and in the Senate, it means that ONS will continue the advocacy work of telling returning members of Congress and, of course, the newly elected ones who are less familiar with what is palliative care and hospice care and its impact on nurses, and how does lymphedema treatment for sleeves and other associated materials affect the health and financial well-being of survivors. They all need to be told what that is and what that means. These are not abstract pieces of arcane legislation. Both bills can and will change the lives, as our nurses know, of millions of people on their journey to treatment once diagnosed with some kind of cancer. These are real people in serious and vulnerable circumstances. So we present this information to decision makers, to the newly elected members of Congress. As our nurses, our members make the case for congressional support. Finally, I'd say that, passing legislation is an arduous task. I sort of alluded to the fact that some of these pieces of legislation have taken a decade to get to where they are now. It does take time and energy, and ONS members have that expertise, and as nurses are the most trusted and ethical profession in the United States for 2 decades in a row. I say that a lot. But even with overwhelming bipartisan support, the voice of the nurse is essential. And it has taken, as I've said, a decade, 8 years, 10 years for both these bills to get as far as they have gotten in December 2022. And there's still a great deal of uncertainty as to what may happen. So that's sort of, where we are and where we stand today.
Wow, that's a lot of information. Again, it just proves the point that nurses and the knowledge that we have, and perhaps maybe just not take for granted, but just is so second nature to us, of information that we know and our ability to translate the impacts that we see on our patients, our ability to speak to that and advocate on behalf of our patients and their needs, or on the nursing workforce, whatever the bill may be. That's information and that's a messaging that can't come from any other source, and that nurses truly have that unique perspective to be able to translate the importance of what is being discussed to really make it meaningful to our representatives that are, potentially positioned to help move things forward or approve things. So thank you for speaking to that. So let's talk about what current ONS priority bills are on the docket.
Palliative care and hospice are currently on the docket. My assumption is they will remain as top priorities for the organization, even if PACHETA, which is the Palliative Care Hospice Education Training Act, PACHETA, does pass. There are many more opportunities to concentrate, as you just said, on providing services through nursing that can be raised later on. I don't want to use the word expanding the legislation, because people will think, government and big government is just going to make it more. No, there are aspects to that can be enhanced or tweaked. And similarly, with the Lymphedema Treatment Act, I would say the same thing, that we will continue to reach out to the U.S. Congress and decision makers to review the definition of, and again, I'm air quoting, durable medical devices. That's the language in the legislation, that are essential to cancer patients, but have been reviewed and have been designated, like compression sleeves, as not necessarily covered by insurance or Medicare. And so that's sort of the point of the bill, is to take those issues and have them covered. And even if they pass those 2 bills in their current state, there would be opportunities to tweak them or, again, enhance them in a way. But I'll say that ONS does a lot of other things other than those two bills. We are engaged with the other nursing professional societies on scope of practice issues. For example, recently in the last week here, at the end of 2022, there was a state issue. We do a little bit of state advocacy, concentrate mostly in federal, but we do engage, particularly in coalitions and with other nursing societies, in state legislative work. For example, in California, a nurse was recently sued for $20,000 for calling herself doctor. She has a DNP. So PhD and DNP nurses are being sued for calling themselves doctors, not calling themselves physicians, but doctors. What is important? I don't need to get into the nuances of the entire issue here, but what's important for ONS and our members to know is that we are involved in these discussions to help policy leaders understand the environment. Again, this is a scope of practice issue. It's huge. ONS will be engaged in those kinds of things and other topics outside of that at the federal level and in state legislatures will include drug pricing through the recently passed IRA, biomarkers, surprise billing, step therapy, pain management, youth smoking cessation. Think about vaping and flavored tobacco, survivorship. We are working with the Congressional Office on a survivorship bill, NIH funding, and cancer moonshot. I could go on. We are not all things to all people, let me say. That seemed like a long list, but know that we are very much engaged with our members who are experts in these fields and our leadership in making sure that we have a voice and a seat at the table. Again, these are just a few of the topics in which ONS is advocating on.
That's great information. As I saw that come through last week about the nurse being sued for calling herself doctor, it kind of raised my hackles a little bit. I'm not going to lie. Not knowing all the details of the case, but just knowing that ONS is aware and listening in for those types of issues that come through, trying to connect with the right partners and coalitions so that our voice can be heard if there are issues that pertain to our membership and our specialty. As you said originally, we have a seat at many different tables and we have different roles depending on the groups that we're working alongside or collaborating with, but it's reassuring for me to know that we have that presence and that and are keeping that sort of vigilance and awareness of things that come up that maybe are somewhat peripheral, but still connected to the work that we do. But it's important to make sure that we have influence when it has an impact on either our nurses or our patients. So thank you for bringing all those topics up for attention.
Advocacy, yes.
Yes. So what happens, you mentioned a lot of different topics or in some specific bills that are on the docket. What happens if those bills don't get passed? And how does ONS keep them moving forward in future sessions if they do need to continue?
Most bills are not passed. There are literally thousands of bills that are introduced in a 2-year congressional session from January 2021 through December 2022, the 117th Congress, as it's known, 2 years. Of the thousands of bills, 213 bills became law. It's a very small percentage. And when I say thousands, I mean close to like 10,000. And 213 became law. That's a whole nother podcast in and of itself.
Yeah.
The process is about incrementalism. It's not sexy, but it's helpful to ensure that bad legislation is caught and massaged, and it's not passed in a frenzy. Oh, we really have to do this. We call this the unintended consequences of legislation. That can be more devastating than having no legislation at all. And so that said, ONS will review our priorities in any bill that doesn't pass, like PCHETA, like lymphedema treatment. And we do have, by the way, a number of bills that aren't passed. For instance, oral parity for cancer drugs. That's a bipartisan bill, as every piece of legislation that ONS is involved in. That is not going to pass. It's already died. We're part of a coalition. My assumption is that we will very much join that coalition, and that piece of legislation will be reintroduced again as we move forward. But we'll review our priorities. We'll look at the congressional landscape. We will assess the appetite for what's on our agenda, and then we'll prioritize legislation that we hope will eventually pass or that we think has a shot as it moves through this process.
I think that's a great reminder, though. It's not what anyone wants to hear. Sometimes playing the long game and being patient and making sure that, you wait till the right time and before pushing things through. As you said, it can sometimes be worse to try to push something through that ultimately creates downstream or unanticipated consequences that actually hurt more people than they help. And so it doesn't feel good when you have to wait or keep waiting and see things take longer than it feels like they should. But that's a good reminder that all good things come to those who wait, I suppose, is what we should remember. So the 118th U.S. Congress begins in January 23, as you mentioned. what is on each chamber's agenda that oncology nurses should know about?
Nobody wants to hear this, but know that the 2024 presidential election has already started, and the congressional agenda of both parties center around that. Sadly, much of this environment is about positioning for the next election and not enacting meaningful changes that, let's say, 80% plus of the American people agree on. Okay? Again, that's a whole nother podcast.
I was going to say, talk about another podcast, Alec. I think
that's a whole nother podcast. But suffice to say, ONS will not engage in those party politics. We will use our members, though, expertise to educate elected officials, congressional staff, federal agencies like NIH, FDA, CDC, CMS, on the impact of legislative language on patients and providers. The ONS Health Policy Agenda is created from a lot of different moving parts that are important to oncology nurses. We hear from our members and our chapters and leadership all the time. We hear in Washington, D.C., who work on ONS's Health Policy Agenda. We create an annual health policy document, and it reflects those priorities. It is then sent to the national ONS National Board, and they make some final decisions. And then here, the D.C. team, we look to see what works in terms of implementing that agenda. And I'll say it's fluid. That is to say, we have our finger on the pulse of the times and we adjust our strategies and which bills to support to fit the congressional mood. It's a process. And so there are a lot that goes into this, but we feel confident that we have a good handle on the environment and what will work, and we promote that. But as I said, it's fluid and it does change, and we're okay with that.
Well, I think that given the fluid nature of Washington, D.C. and how things rapidly change there, I think that's probably the best strategy, is to keep things flexible and kind of bob and weave as needed. So let's get more specific. Let's talk about oncology nurses as an individual and why is it important for them to advocate? Do nurses have the power to influence policies or make real substantive change?
Absolutely. So let me say this. It's important for all nurses to advocate for themselves, for their practice, for their profession, for their patients. Without the nursing community advocating for itself, no other entity will. Not the physicians, not the hospitals, not the patients. Not to say that those groups both should do that or that they're antagonistic to nurses. I'm not implying that. I'm just saying that it is the nurse's responsibility to be their own advocate. As, by the way, those other groups are their own advocates. This is a self-interested system and process. And ironically, I like to say, only nurses are advocating for others. They're advocating for colleagues. They're advocating for coordinated care. They're advocating for institutions. They're advocating for patients. What I say to our members and to the nursing community writ large, it's time for nursing to really stand up, especially during COVID, when you are on the front lines and have been for 2 years and are still there, and demand scope of practice autonomy, educational opportunities, research funding, and other priorities, whatever they may be as they come along, that are important to the profession. There are 4 million American nurses. Let me say that again. There are 4 million American nurses. That is a powerful statement in and of itself. You are the largest provider group by far in the United States, but not flexing your advocacy muscle will continue to have others make decisions for nurses and the profession. And that should not be the case.
Well, I would agree with that. I think we're going to learn here about how maybe there are some tactics that we can take either as individuals or maybe in local chapters that we can perhaps flex those muscles a little bit better. So how are local ONS chapters and other ONS member volunteers like health policy chairs, how are they involved in ONS's advocacy work?
We are really, with 200 chapters, almost 200 chapters across the country, we have what I like to refer to as a grassroots army that carries our message to their representatives. And we do this in Jackson, Mississippi, in Ames, Iowa, in Sacramento, California, in Bangor, Maine, and across the country throughout many of our chapters. That is what makes this process work. I'm not suggesting that everyone in an ONS chapter be a health policy liaison. I'm saying, first of all, the chapter would absolutely benefit, and the society as a whole would benefit if we had, 90% of the chapters designated some member, and that may be you member who's listening right now, to be the health policy liaison or the chair or whatever designation and title the chapter wants to call it, to a nurse in that position. I work for you, nurses out there. So if you're interested, please email me, astone@ons.org, and let's start working in your chapter. We have done this year alone. I'm trying to offhand, 30 some odd different engagements where the chapter has met with its congressional staff in the district. Now, I'm not coming to DC. I'm saying doing a health policy event. Either it's an evening, a Thursday night, your chapter evening, and I present virtually. I go out to the chapters now that we're sort of back with some in real life presentations and present to the chapters. And in most times when I go out to present, I take 2 or 3 nurses, the chapter's health policy liaison chair, with me to a congressional district meeting where they get to meet the congressional staff there, which I'm not saying is more important than the elected official, but it's kind of more important than the elected official. And you build those relationships with the staff so that when the staff says, gee, we have this bill on cancer, we have this bill on nursing, bring me the file from that, that white file with the ONS letters on it. I need to speak to that nurse who is here on Main Street at Maintown Hospital. And that nurse is going to be my conduit to explain what this legislation means. And that's where really the rubber meets the road. And that's what we do. And we've connected those. We've had, since COVID started, close to 100 congressional meetings virtually and in person. And we're much more engaged. And we do that through the chapters in health policy. And we're trying to do them statewide as well. And so a lot of opportunities, and really hope the chapters want to be engaged. So I welcome it. Reach out to me if you're interested. astone@ons.org.
That's just amazing to think through that and just how powerful our voice can be if we mobilize all of our resources. If it's a federal issue, then all of our chapters across the nation. If it's something more local, just thinking through. Sometimes the challenge is you don't know where to start. I mean, it can be as simple as, do you even know who your representatives are? But beyond that, as you mentioned, sometimes, yes, it's nice to meet the actual person in that position, but knowing their staff can be just as, if not more, important and influential to be able to be maybe on their short list of someone they can reach out to if they've got questions or need information. Getting in that short list of people so that you can make sure your voice in the position of nurses and oncology nurses specifically is heard. Getting that foot in the door can be so important. So sounds like hopefully you'll be getting a flurry of emails after this episode goes live so that we can shore up that process and make sure that every chapter understands what resources are out there and some options for them to work in their local communities about issues that are important to them. So you mentioned that, of course, ONS is not working alone, that we are part of many organizational coalitions and groups that are kind of working towards the same ends. So how has our work in these organizations helped to sort of position us in the health policy arena?
I have a grid, and it has literally like 107 organizations in which ONS is involved in at some level. That doesn't mean that in all of those groups, we are a paying member and sit at the table. It means that they may have one meeting a year and, or one letter that they send in, and we join hundreds of groups and put our name on that as well. So we are very active. I also want to reiterate that what we say here in Washington is swim in your lane. We are not going to pontificate on going to Mars. We don't talk about agricultural issues. We're not engaged in international policies that are outside of healthcare and borders in Asia or something. We stay in our lane. It's a narrow lane of oncology nursing. And we may deviate a little bit in healthcare and other aspects that are involved, but really we're in our lane. I am confident in saying that of the 54 national U.S. nursing professional societies, ONS is one of the leaders, along with the ANA, with a robust advocacy agenda and professional staff. We motivate and we mobilize our members through communications and updates. And so we're constantly talking to them about what's going on. And oftentimes a member will reach out to me saying, I just read this post that ONS did, and this is very important to me. And so we energize and we engage. And when our members step forward and say, this is important to me, and that's happened a lot during COVID, where we have established a lot of internal groups. We have a minority nurses group, and we have an LGBTQ plus group, and we have, starting in 2023, a Latino group, and we have one that works just on the environment. I mean, these are very focused internal health policy groups for ONS. That's a subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup. But when we need nurses, oncology nurses, we get them to contact their elected officials, and then those elected officials listen because they understand that our members are very serious and they're expert in what they do. And so the same goes in the federal regulatory environment as well. You might ask, what does success look like? So when it comes to the White House, the FDA, the CDC, congressional offices, when they reach out to ONS and they ask our leaders if we would provide insight into a policy as it's being created and formed, that means we have both a figurative and a literal seat at the table. A literal seat at the table. That is success. And I'll tell you that few national nursing organizations of the 54 outside of the ANA have that which ONS has built up and we are committed to. So there is a lot here, and we are trying to hone our priorities and be that engaged as we move forward in what is of interest to the oncology nurse. I'll say this, that I wake up every day as ONS's government relations director thinking, okay, so what don't I know? Or where should we be? Or where should we be that we're not? And we need to insinuate ourselves into those conversations. And I remind myself that ASCO is dealing with the oncologist, right? And the American Cancer Society is promoting the cancer patient and survivor. ONS is about the oncology nurse. Not that the oncology nurse is not worried about coordinated care with the oncologist and the pharmacist and the social worker and the patient and the caregiver. And certainly with American Cancer Society, the oncologist is of course concerned about the patient. But ONS's role really is that of the oncology nurse. And so that's what we focus on. We bring in all those other partners in this process along with us. But we're about the oncology nurse.
And I really like how you mentioned that the oncology nurse is not a single issue or a single problem to solve. There are subgroups and subtopics and various ways that for issues or concerns that individual nurses feel passionate about, there's room for that. And there's a need for those nurses to take up leadership positions to help move those agenda items along. And so I think that's one of those sort of hidden gems of ONS membership that isn't always sort of tangible, but, as we talk today, just realizing how much of a presence and how well we're represented at that national stage is really reassuring and is something to be proud of, I think.
Yes. I am like everyone else. I have professional societies, which I join and I pay personal money to, and I'm a member of. I like to see it when our leadership is engaged with the powers that be in the world. It lets me know that my professional organization recognizes what's important and is moving forward. And I will absolutely say to all of our members that it is a charge the executive staff at ONS and the leadership in the 12 years that I've been at ONS totally recognizes and promotes. So in that respect, that's absolutely the case.
Every time I talk with you, Alec, I feel like I learned like 10 new things. So I certainly appreciate your time spent with us today. But as we approach the end of our episode today, there are a few kind of summarizing questions that we like to ask just to make sure that we hit all the highlights. So to start things off, what are some common misconceptions about advocacy and health policy?
No one is listening or will listen to me. I'm just a nurse. I've actually heard that from ONS members. And let me say, huge misconception. Far from it. Decision makers absolutely want to hear from nurses. They want them involved. They want their input. And this does not happen overnight. So advocacy is not a one-time event. Instead, know that I speak in metaphors. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And that constant vigilance is required in this. And so ONS continues to be committed to advocacy as a foundational, as I just said, a foundational organizational principle. That's it. One person can't make a difference.
What is something about advocacy or health policy that's not often discussed, but you wish people knew more about?
I literally just said it. One person can make a difference. Sometimes that's major, but more often it's a spark that ignites a larger effort. So regardless, participatory democracy works because one person can make a difference. Advocacy, health advocacy in particular, changes the world. And if I had to mention, let's say, Dorothea Dix, Clara Barton, Lillian Ward, Margaret Sanger, And of course, the first and strongest advocate, Florence Nightingale. One person changing the way we think and act. That's advocacy. So it could be global, but usually it starts local. It's not difficult. You can do it. And, we need you and I'm here to help.
That's a great point that it can be as local as your school board. If they're making decisions on, health policy, which many of them had to do over the past 2.5 years, there is influence and there's a place for a nurse's voice to be heard. I hope that no nurse feels as though adding their voice to that conversation would not be valuable, because it certainly would be.
We have at ONS a plethora of resources, one of which is I'm very proud of, not really doing the technical stuff, a huge team. We redesigned Advocacy 101. It is a free course, ONS Advocacy 101. I encourage our members to take this free course, Advocacy 101. It's great. It's been revamped. It's very interactive, and it really gives you the basis for advocacy work, and it introduces you to the subject. So if you get the opportunity, I encourage our members to take. I learned actually a month ago, I think something like 7,000 nurses have taken our course, not all ONS members. So it's a tremendous resource, and I really hope that our members take advantage of it.
Absolutely. And as you just mentioned, the course itself is not oncology specific or heavy. It's any nurse that is interested in learning about advocacy could benefit from taking that course. So I've shared it with non-oncology colleagues who want to learn more. And I think that's a great way to not only invite them to be part of advocacy as well on behalf of all nurses, but it also shines a light on how ONS values advocacy and participating in that process. And so I think it is beneficial in a variety of ways.
Yes.
Do you have any final comments to share with us today, Alec?
Absolutely. I'm an advocate, so I always have a final comment to add. So I'll say, I have worked in the political and policy process for longer than I actually care to discuss on this podcast, both as a volunteer and as a professional. I've been in ONS for 12 years, and together we have grown the advocacy and health policy effort to a bold and strong network. We have close to 4,000 ONS members who receive weekly and monthly updates and blogs and articles. So if you want to join that, we are always looking for more members to do that. That is 10% of our membership who says, I want to be aware of what's going on in health policy. The society has been to the White House in the past 3 administrations. We went to the White House because Biden and moonshot. We have been at the White House in the past 3 administrations, Obama, Trump, and Biden. Okay. We have brought more than 1,000 nurses to DC to meet with their members of Congress in the House and in the Senate. We have helped federal agencies like the NIH, the FDA, the CDC, CMS understand the role of the nurse in healthcare. ONS members should know, and they should be very proud that their professional society is representing them with the powers that be, and they are being heard. But the work continues, and we need more advocates. So join us and be a part of this. It's important.
Well, as I said, I always come away from chatting with you, learning something new, and always certainly having an appreciation for the complexity and the importance of engaging in that advocacy work to make sure that our voices and the needs of our patients are heard. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, Alec.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.